If you're visiting with us tonight, outlines, communion tables, I apologize, I put the wrong number, but the title is Saul's Demise, David's Rise, and the numbers, it shouldn't be this high. I had put this down for something else, and when I went to this particular one, I didn't change the number, so that one's my fault. One of the things we had talked about early on is that, and I still like to use the example of Joseph just because it's easy and we know a lot about him. But we just mentioned there's always three levels that we can do a class, particularly from the Old Testament. And the bottom level, I just use the term biography, personal life. And if you read Genesis 37 through 50, a lot of details. And here's the young man who's the 11th son in a rivalry between two sisters, which is just heartbreaking. But still, and everything from the special coat and being sold into Egypt. And so you can do this whole thing and say, okay, here's the personal life, here's the biography. Secondly, you can come back and really cover the whole material and talk about what is God doing in terms of forming a nation. Because if you remember all the way back to Abraham, then through you I'm going to bless all nations, I will make your name great. And God is continuing this process, and it's going to run all the way through the rest of the Old Testament and is kind of the background for some things in the New Testament. But the one that we don't do too much of is that you can come back and do the same material and just talk about God. What is God doing in this particular time? And a part of tonight's lesson, there's kind of a bittersweetness about it. A part of tonight's lesson is really discouraging from this point of view. Saul's spiritual life, his emotional life, is just in a steady state of decline. And it's going to go all the way till his death at the end of 1 Samuel. And again, I just hear this echo of this country western song, what might have been? And you think, what could have happened in Saul's life? What might have been? And one of the things I'd just like to look at is first one example about God. And again, if we had three different either chairs or people, Abraham is approximately 2,000 years in front of the cross. And again, that's always easy to remember because Abraham's the same distance before the cross as we are after the cross. And so every time we read about Abraham, in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, if this is the cross, then Abraham is going to be 2,000 years on the other side. The major characters are approximately 500 years apart. Moses is going to be roughly in the 1500s, and when we come to Saul and David, we're at 1,000. So and there's some discussion, they may be off 100 years or so, but just in terms of just kind of markers, that's easy to remember. And so when we listen to God telling Abraham, come outside and count the stars tonight. And if you can count the stars, you'll be able to count your children. And this starts when he's 75, and it's still going when he's 99, and Sarah's 89, and they're getting older and older, and God keeps saying, count the stars. Well, 2,000 years before. One of the things that God tells Abraham, is that 4 generations are going to be taken away into captivity, and this is going to take place starting with Joseph. They're going to go into Egypt. And when we come to Moses, we're approximately 1,500 years before the cross. And one of the and there was a host of just struggles and things that happened. But with Moses' guidance, the people are going to cross the Red Sea. And before they get into the Promised Land, they are attacked by a group of people called the Amalekites. And the Amalekites are going to be, can I use the term Bedouin? Thinking about tents, Arabians type thing. The Amalekites are going to be kind of a Bedouin type thing, much less a farming, housing, agricultural group. But they attacked the Israelites as God is taking them toward the Promised Land, 1,500 years. And God's going to say, at a point in time, I will bring justice against these people. And guess what? Nearly 500 years later, God says to King Saul, I want you to go and attack the Amalekites, and Saul disobeys him. And here's what's significant. Well, let me say it this way, and I don't mean this to be trite or anything. But my dad had an expression. He said, if something happened, you just go crawl under a rock and wait till this happens. That was just one of his kind of farm expressions. Just go crawl under a rock and wait for a while. Well, God says to Abraham, I'm going to give you this land. And it's actually going to be, and it's not happening yet, but anticipate, the fulfillment of the dimensions of the land promise are not going to come until the full reign of King David. So when God says, I'm going to give you this land, walk the length and the breadth of it, on and on, what does he have when he dies? He has a cave to bury his wife. And here for these decades, you've walked back and forth, and you've lived in this land, and you built altars, and God keeps saying, I'm going to give you this land. Well, let 1,000 years go by, and when David comes along, God's going to finally give him the boundaries of that land. So in the same way that back with Moses in the 1500s, God says, I'm going to punish this people, then when he tells Saul, I want you to go and destroy, and I think this is probably a tribal area because we're going to see this group of people again. It's not all of them, but Saul attacked the area, but what did he do? He saved the best. He did not kill the king. And his excuse to Samuel was, well, the people made me or wanted to. And so here's God's talking to Saul, but here's what I want you to see. In what God asked Saul to do in terms of obedience, is God fulfilling something that he promised he would do 500 years earlier. And when we look at Saul's decline, and it's going to be in multiple ways, and I just kind of shuddered when I wrote this down. Growing up listening to the King James Bible, she was called the Witch of Endor, a spiritist, a medium. And remember last week we looked at the works of the flesh, and it had to do with, you look at that, and the middle part of the works of the flesh in Galatians 5, Saul is practicing every one of these. And he is going to go to this medium, to this witch, and he doesn't turn and listen to God. Let me say one other thing, and then we'll just kind of walk through the latter part of 1 Samuel because we want to talk more about David in the ones that are coming. This still haunts me, and I use haunt in kind of a quotation mark. But I'm in a class with leadership with Everett Hufford, and he just asked a very generic question, and I didn't have a percent in my mind, but he said, if you just look at the leaders in the Bible, and just use the broad term, the leaders in the Bible, what percentage of the leaders of the Bible finished well? Just I'm not going to say anything, but just kind of bring a number to your mind. What percentage of the leaders of the Bible finished well? And then here it came. Fewer than 30%. And some are going to be cut off when they're young, like Jonathan. Remember James, going to be beheaded in Acts chapter 12. Some are going to make colossal mistakes like David did, and he still repents and comes back. And then you look at someone like Solomon, his wives turned his heart away from God. And toward the end of Solomon's life, he's a virtual pagan. And he's the son of a man after God's own heart. And Everett said one of the things that we need to keep in mind for us personally is that fewer than 30% of the leaders in the Bible finished well. And then here it came. He said, I'd like to challenge you guys to be part of that group. Something we've talked about with our kids growing up, and it's not just a pessimistic state, but do you remember when Abraham starts bargaining with God for the righteous people in the city of Gomorrah? Where do they start? They start at 50, and this is a terrible way to say this. It's so culturally inappropriate, but Hugo McCord said, this is how we know that Abraham was the first Jew. He got God from 50 down to 10, and he kept asking him for a lower one and a lower one. But he finally says, if we can find 10 righteous people, well, stop and think about this. Who's living in Sodom? Lot, his wife, and hopefully 2 daughters. So we only need how many more? 6. We only need 6 more. And guess what? We can't find 6 righteous people in this city. And at different times, Sheila would say to our kids, let's be one of the 10. Do you understand what she's saying by that? Regardless of what's going on in the culture around you, regardless of what's happening with friends and family and culture, let's decide we are going to be one of the 10. We're going to be one of those people. And so what we have tonight is it's kind of like this slow, long decline in Saul's life. And as we mentioned last week, he is just obsessed with trying to kill David. And all of the things that he could have done, and we're talking about as the king, he could have strengthened. You all look at it politically, financially, militarily, economically, socially, list goes on and on. And virtually he squandered all of his abilities and all of his opportunities because of the jealousy that had just drove him to the point that he's just consumed with trying to kill David. So here's our central idea, and this is sad. Toward the end of his life, God no longer listened to Saul. And just kind of think about the consequences of that. It's not an exact parallel, but do you remember in the book of Romans, they start listing all of these different sins, and at a point in time it will say, God did what? God gave them up. God gave them up. God comes to Jeremiah, and his ministry is going to be roughly 640, and he's going to be there till the third destruction in 586. So this long career. And with our small children, here's Jeremiah, and he's the weeping prophet. And God says, because of the shedding of innocent blood, this city is going to be destroyed. And I just shudder when I read this every time. God says, don't pray for them. Do you know how serious that is? We never paraphrase God, but basically, don't waste your breath. Don't pray for them. At a certain point, sin has become such a major part of their life that they've gone past the point, whether it's through hardness of heart or repetition of sin, and they're continuing to live in this lifestyle. Jeremiah, don't pray for them. Well, this is what's going to happen with Saul. And then here's the contrast. And it's like we're going to have 2 very opposites. Saul's going to have a decline. David's going to keep rising. At every significant intersection, junction, decision in his life, guess what David does? He inquires of the Lord. And they have these things from the priest, the Urim and the Thummim, these other things. But just at virtually every significant point, the first thing David is going to say, let's inquire of the Lord about that. Saul is going to be looking for leads from other people. Saul's going to be talking with other people. And at a point in time, God will not answer him. And that's what I said, that's so sad about tonight, because we're going to have kind of these 2 very opposites of contrast. So as we go through, we will notice the contrast between the continual disobedience of Saul and the obedience of David. When you look at 1 Samuel 28, 6 through 7, and again, here he is pursuing David. Saul inquired of the Lord, and the Lord didn't answer him. And this is going to happen a little bit later, but I wanted to introduce it right here. And Saul said to his servants, seek for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, behold, there's a medium at Endor. And like I said, the older, and some of the newer translations, but the older translations will use sometimes the term necromancer, which is like someone who tries to call up the dead, or even just the term witch is used. And you think, God at one point early in his life has given him a new heart, but he has just continued to disobey God at every junction. And just before he dies, rather than saying, let's find a priest, let's talk to the Lord, let's go find a medium. Now, I'm currently totally out of date, totally. But a few years ago, does anybody know what was the most widely read section of the New York Times? Horoscope. More people checked and read their horoscopes than any other part of the paper. And you can just kind of see this influence has so many different ways in which it expresses itself and does this. And this is going to be a part of this contrast, is that he seeks first his own will. He seeks, oh, what are people saying? And then all the time David is saying, Lord, what do you want me to do? And the contrast is going to be very strong. 1 Samuel 22, 9 and 10. David is going to go to Ahitub, depending on how you translate that, a priest, and he will inquire of the Lord for him. And he also then gave him the sword of Goliath. David is going to rescue the inhabitants of Keilah, and this is 1 Samuel 23, 1 and 2. The Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors. And see, here it is, David inquired of the Lord. And there's more than we're going to be able to list, but I just want you to notice, at every significant juncture of his life, why do you think he is called the man after God's own heart? Now, I'll be the first to say that today, sometimes we don't know exactly what we should do. But having said that, wouldn't it do us all well to spend devoted time both in prayer and in study and in counsel? Because you're going to hear Saul several times say, oh, I thought. Where David, rather than saying, I thought, David is going to say, oh, let's inquire of the Lord. What does the Lord want us to do in this particular situation? And that's going to be a part of this widening contrast that's going to be there. And so if you notice, kind of roughly in the middle, these are just examples. David inquired of the Lord. David inquired of the Lord. And this is a part of this growing contrast between the two. When you look at the second one, and this is 1 Samuel 23 through 26, and like I said, the word obsessed is not too strong. Saul is just doing everything within his power to try to hunt him down and track him down. Now, I wouldn't bring this up to your grandkids. Did any of you grow up watching the Roadrunner cartoon? Beep, beep. And Coyote just goes to all kinds of schemes, and he's going to do this, he's going to do this, he's going to do this, and that's the whole plot of the cartoon. And then you hear beep beep, and then it backfires on him or something else. I'm sorry, nobody in antiquity would think of something as silly as that. But in terms of kind of the uselessness of his behavior and his actions and his schemes, here's the contrast. Saul is relying upon his physical strength. And remember when I talked with my little kids, Samuel anoints the first king, and Saul is tall, head and shoulders above everyone. And Saul is going to rely on his physical strength and abilities. And then David, the beloved, is going to trust in God. This has multiple applications, and I just want to mention on the run and keep looking at some other things. But this is so true. Sometimes an unguarded strength can be our greatest weakness. Can I say that again? Sometimes an unguarded strength can be our greatest weakness. And because initially he is Saul, and he is tall, and he is strong, as he goes through his life, then he relies on the physical aspects of this. And then here's the little shepherd boy, and his reliance is going to be so much more on God. So there's two very distinctive events that take place. And while David is a man on the run, and Saul has chased him over the empire, when you look in 1 Samuel 24, and this is very personal, virtually it's just a part of human life, Some translations will say Saul needed to go to the bathroom. He needed to relieve himself. And so when you get down to that area around the Dead Sea, it's very, very barren, but there's a lot of caves. In fact, this is not far from the area where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And so David and his men, because they're being chased, they have gone to the back of this cave, and Saul comes in to go to the bathroom. And what are some of David's closest doing? Kill him. You know, he's left the army, he's come in, he's gone to the bathroom, kill him. And how this was accomplished, I don't know, because you would think someone would hear this, but what does David do? Rather than killing him, then he cuts off a part of his robe and preserves it. After Saul leaves and is some distance away, then David goes out and he shows, I have a part of your robe. I literally had cut it off from you. And you look at, this is under 2:1 right in the middle. As David is encouraged to kill the person who is obsessed with killing him, what does he say? The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. And then as he talks to Saul, he will say, the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. Someone told me to kill you, but I spared you. I will not put out my hand against the Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. And Saul briefly, verbally repents, and then the hunt is on again. I say this very personally with no sense of malice, but one of the older guys that I worked with when I first started in ministry, and this wasn't a live event, but we were just talking about life in general, and he said, son, anytime you feel like retaliating, he said, don't get involved and mess up something that is on time God may do a whole lot better than you will. There are some things that we need to turn back over to God and let God deal with, because when we get involved, and it's like that tar baby, and something happens and we do something, and there are some things that at a point in time are best just turned back to the Lord. But here again is the man of God's own heart in action. He knows he is the anointed. Is he living like it? No. Does he have a lot of faults? Yes. Is he a poor king in many, many ways? Yes. But he is still the Lord's anointed. And this is the first opportunity that David has while he's in the cave, and he will not do that. We have an encounter then, as again they're on the run. David's men are out, and this is something that's always interesting in the Old Testament. The names of the people oftentimes tell the story. And the man that David is asking if they can have some of the sheep and supplies, and then he goes just berserk. His name is Nabal, and David is really angry. He's going to go wipe him out. And then his wife's name is Abigail, and she comes to David with gifts and intercedes for her husband. But what are their names? Nabal means fool, foolish. And bless her heart, she looks like a real sweetheart from what we can tell from the text. And his name, she says, oh, my husband's name is like the foolish or the stupid one. And even though this is his character, he's still very wealthy. Abigail, my father's joy, my father's exalted. And with her common sense and her appeal, and she appeases David's anger, and she basically tells him, don't stain your character by doing this. Leave him alone. And again, this is just, it's kind of ironic. The wife waits until her husband has had a few drinks and he's in a kind of a high spirit, and then she tells him that she has given some things to David, and who knows what happens, but apparently he has a stroke. It's like his heart froze within him. And when David hears that she is a widow, then he goes and asks, and she comes, and she actually becomes one of his wives. So that's that incident that takes place in 1 Samuel 25. But back to King Saul, and here's the second time that this is mentioned here. This time Saul decides, we're going to bring out 3,000 men. And if you notice, and we'll see this in a second, different ones had started coming to David. If you were in debt, if you had difficulty, all kinds of odd things were going on in people's lives, and David was a safe place to go. the most men that we have a count of is 600. And so Saul, being the king, then musters and organizes 3,000 men now to come out, and we're going to go hunt him down. The only problem is this: how do you hide 3,000 men? And because there's so many, and you have intelligence with people and with events that are going on, then David's men had good advice. This is where they are. This is what's going on and things that are happening. They're in the camp. The Lord causes, and you'll see the text will say, a deep sleep to come upon them. And David takes one of his men with him and goes and takes Saul's spear and his water bottle. And again, his friend with him says, let's kill him. We're right here, let's kill him. And David won't do it. And then when he gets a safe distance, he calls to Saul and shows him again the second time he had been close to him. And 1 Samuel 26:9, who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And again mentions the Lord gave you into my hand, but he refused to kill him. When you look at the back of the first page, and this is going to be one of these temporary repentances that we hear from Saul. Saul is going to say, I have sinned, I have acted foolishly, I have made a great mistake. And David is doing what he can to reconcile the situation, and Saul just keeps bringing it to a flame. Hopefully you don't go through this very often, but there's a very important passage that says, in as much as is possible with you. How does the rest of the verse go? Live at peace with all men. What happens if I don't want to live at peace? If you have done your part and you continue to do your part to live at peace and don't retaliate and reciprocate, you have done what God's asked you to do. And this is a hard lesson as we go through life. There are some people who just do not want to live at peace. Chuck White, one of my dear friends, referring to a girl in our youth group, he said, she's the spoon that stirs the pot. And just at every occasion, she's doing what she can to keep things stirred up and to keep things going. And there's just going to be some times in life that that's going to be the case. David has done everything he can. He has saved his life. He's prevented others from killing him when he had the opportunity. But Saul is not willing to do that. That's not David's fault. And he has done his part to do what God has asked him to do. So just kind of an unbelievable thing happens. And this is Roman numeral 3. When you come to 1 Samuel 27-30, David has been rejected earlier by the Philistines. And remember, he's had spit running down and pretended to be insane and climbed the walls and stuff. Ziklag, if here's the Dead Sea and here's Jerusalem, then Ziklag is south toward Egypt, but it's not over into the main part of the Philistine territory. So it's on the far eastern part of the Philistine territory, but it's not in the heart of Philistia. And David goes and brokers an agreement for he and his men, and you just kind of shudder when you think about this. Can I say this? To live on the outskirts of Philistine territory. Different people read this differently. Some people feel like, well, he didn't trust in God and he left. I kind of wonder if you have Saul with all the resources of the Israeli army, it may be wise not to be living in the immediate territory. There's a limit of places that you can hide. And for this particular part of the story, then David is going to leave the south part of Judah, go down into the very edge of the Philistine territory at Ziklag, and this is going to be his base of operation. And by the time he eventually becomes king, Ziklag is going to become a part of Israel. And then here's the other thing too, back with Abraham. When you look at the farthest boundaries that God promises Abraham, at the height of David's reign, including Ziklag and the part south of this, then God is going to fulfill these 1,000-year-old promises to Abraham through the kingship of David, and this is going to be a part of the territory that becomes a part of it. So here we're under number 3, 1 Samuel 27. He makes a request. Ziklag becomes his home base. And as we're going to see, there's 600 men who are with him. And David goes and his men, and they live in this particular place. And so here's 1 Samuel 27. And this is kind of a time of relative peace for a period of time in David's life. When it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. So Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. David lived in the country of the Philistines for 1 year and 4 months. And I think probably out of just the desire for some type of physical safety. Hopefully none of us have ever had someone aggressively trying to kill us. But can you imagine trying to sleep at night when the king and 3,000 guys are looking for any way they can to kill you? I mean, every little twig that would break, it would be hard to sleep. And this whole process is going to be a part of God developing the heart of the man after God's own heart. But let me say something militarily, then let's keep trucking on this. In time, David is going to become the king, and the empire of Israel is going to be spread to its furthest borders that it's ever going to be. And how better to train someone to be a general and a king than to have him being hunted by Saul during this particular part of his life? Let me say the same thing in a different way. One of the reasons I was so blessed to go to Quartz Mountain Camp is that there were just some things going on in my life that I was just frustrated, I was angry, who knows, 14 years old. And our local preacher, Lyndall, was just a dear friend and in fact still is today. And we didn't wear a watch because we got up with the sun and we went till the sun went down. And other than going to church, time didn't mean anything. But what I remember is that when we started talking, the moon was right here. And when we finished talking, the moon was back here. And one of the things that Lyndall convinced me of is that he said, every time God brings struggles into your life, he may be helping you to kind of grow and to develop a strength through this struggle that then he is going to want to use later in your life to do something that you wouldn't do near as well without having gone through this struggle. And if you stop and look back at your life, there are times that you have had difficulties and trials and other things that in his own time, God may use that to equip you and enable you to do something that you couldn't do without that struggle and that growth. And I think that's exactly what's going on here. How better to train someone to be an efficient general than to have him a man on the run for as long as David was. He has learned to think like the enemy would think. And as being the king and the general later of Israel, this time on the run from Saul is going to equip him in a totally different way. But even as the shepherd boy, you know, we had sheep from the time I was 6th grade till I went to college. I wouldn't dare think about the paw and of the lion and the bear. Okay, I'm okay with bobcats. I'm okay with coyotes. I'm okay with dogs. Dealt with all those. The lion and the bear. And you see what I'm saying? All of those events in David's life, God is using to equip him to do something that at the time he could never see that God was going to do with him. And so here he's going to live on the fringe, on the edge of Philistine territory for this particular time. This is just hard to read, but it's a part of the text, and this is number 4. Samuel died. And remember, we had literally the hinge. Samuel's the hinge of the Old Testament, caused by anointing the kings. The history of Israel is going to forever be changed. And the Philistines assembled, 1 Samuel 28:4. Saul saw the army. He was afraid. His heart trembled. Saul inquired of the Lord, and the Lord didn't answer him. And then here it comes. Seek out for me a medium that I may go to her and inquire of her. and I just shudder when I read this part. They go, and no one's more surprised than this lady is when God allows Samuel to come back. And Samuel, as he had said in his lifetime, is going to say to him, and you'll find this in chapter 28:17, the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand, has given it to your neighbor David, and because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and carry out his wrath against the Amalekites, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Translated, you and your sons are going to die tomorrow. And how low in a person's spiritual life can you get that here God has anointed you with Samuel, God has given you a new heart, and just through this continual disobedience, then Samuel gets to the point that he's gone to a medium. Like I said, our older translations called her the Witch of Endor, to seek for the guidance. We have another interlude. David and his men are out on a raid, and a group of Amalekites come through. They steal the wives and the children, but they're having this drunken brawl, and David and the men go and capture them. And we'll come to this later when we talk about Jonathan. But the people are so angry with David, they want to stone him. And here's the contrast, and you'll see this in many different ways. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And that's going to be the contrast. Saul is going to go seek a medium, some type of spiritualist, and David is going to inquire continually, and then in this case, strengthen himself in the Lord his God. So, when we look at the second page, David continues to inquire the Lord. God gives him permission to do that, and they won that battle. And this is hard to read, but then you go to the next chapter, and the Philistines overpower the Israelites. Saul's 3 sons are killed. Saul is going to fall on his own sword rather than be killed. They're going to decapitate him, hang their bodies on the wall, and then valiant men went and took the bodies down and buried them, and we'll see that in a second. There's many, but these 4 verses I just want you to notice, and we'll touch on these again a little bit later. Every time we read through any part of Scripture, they're just, I think of these as anchor verses, but listen to 1 Samuel 13:14. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. And that's going to be this distinguishing character. When he talks to Samuel, the Lord does not look as man sees. The man looks on the outward appearance. The Lord looks on the heart. And I think of this a lot when I listen to people with contemporary music, worship. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard, well, you know, God wants me to use my gift. And either I have a gift of playing a guitar or she has a gift of singing, and God wants me to use my gift. Or other people say, well, you know, if Paul were alive today, and one of the verses I keep hearing is, to obey is better than sacrifice. And that became very much a part of David's life. He didn't always obey, but he always repented and turned back to God. And we'll see this when we talk about Jonathan. There is but a step between me and death. And one night, Lord willing, we're just going to probably highlight some of the Psalms that are written, because when you look at number 1, Saul is pursuing David, but David is always pursuing God. And there's several of the Psalms, while David was in the cave. And what you'll notice is that in our handwriting, most of them will fit on the back of a 5x7 envelope. If you're on the run, you don't have manuscripts and all this other stuff. And several of these Psalms that David writes, which again reflects his heart and his attitude toward God, Saul is seeking David. David is always seeking God. The vocabulary, and I just did one sample, and we'll look at these later. The geographical features where David hid are then going to become vocabulary in his Psalms. And you think, refuge, cave, other things. A quick sample, Psalm 18:2. The Lord is my rock and my fortress, my deliverer. My God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my stronghold. The Lord lives, blessed be my rock, and exalted be the God of my salvation. And this is what's going to be a part of his vocabulary and his songs, is going to be the experiences that he has. This to me is very important for all of us. One of David's endearing qualities is that he is willing to listen to criticism without being offended or offensive. And Abigail's going to come to him, can I say, talk sense to him, and he chooses to listen to her. Later, Nathan's going to say, after the affair with Bathsheba, remember the little lamb? And then he says, you're the man. And this is one of those endearing qualities of David. And again, one of my older preachers, he said, son, always listen carefully to your critics, because God may be telling you something through your critics that your closest friends either may not or will not tell you. He said you don't have to believe them, but just listen to them. And that's something that David did. And rather than either getting angry or lashing out, he was very, very good about doing that. Let's look at these last things and we'll finish up with this. David's loyalty to God is reflected in the loyalty the people around him had toward him. And this will become an entire lesson later. But you'll notice if you're in distress, you're in debt, if you were bitter in soul, then you went to David. And he continually leaves his life in the hands of God. For example, remember he takes his parents to Moab, and you go back to the story of Ruth, and she is a Moabitess. So to protect his family, David takes his mom and dad and takes them back to like 3 generations old home. And what does he say? You stay there until I know what the Lord will do for me. This is hard. Do you remember later when he does the census and there were 3 options? And David says, let me not fall into the hands of men, but let me fall into the hands of the Lord. And even when he sinned, David had this capacity to turn and trust in God. I thought of this. Remember Jesus? You've heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. I say, love your enemies, pray for those. And it's so interesting. We want a king. Did not turn out so well, did it? With the first one. And because we want to be like the nations around us. And you'll see David continues to inquire of the Lord. And David is going to destroy another part of God's enemies while he's in Ziklag. Like I said, another part of the Amalekites. It's gradually a group are being strengthened, which will allow him to become the king in the next part. And then I just thought this was touching. David cared for both the dead and the living in Saul's family. Saul has not been his friend. Saul has done everything within his ability as the king to hunt him down and to kill him. And what happens? When they told David the sons of Jabesh Gilead have buried Saul, 2 Samuel 2, 4-6, David sent messengers, may you be blessed by the Lord, you showed loyalty to Saul your Lord, you buried him, may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness to you, and I will do good to you because of these things. And then later in the kingship, as we get into 2 Samuel 21, they're going to even remove the bones of Saul and David again and bury them back at the home place. And you think, how many people would have this kind of generosity toward the dead of someone who spent so much energy and wasted so much of their lives in trying to kill him? But how touching is this? He's going to become the king. We're in 2 Samuel 9. And the king said, is there not still someone in the house of Saul that I may show kindness to them? Isn't that amazing? With all the things that Saul has done and has a bitter of an enemy as he has been, when David finally consolidates the kingdom, he says, is there anybody in the house of Saul that's still alive? And I will still show kindness to them. And you see what I'm talking about in terms of kind of this forgiving spirit that's so much Christ-like in so many ways. Ziba said to the king, and how interesting, he doesn't initially ask a son of Jonathan, he says Saul, but who's alive? Oh, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David. And we'll save just one lesson for Saul and David, but I thought how appropriate. He is still wanting to look after the house of the man who hunted him down, and the benefit of that was his dearest friend. There's one of his sons that are left. Let's close with this, and then we'll be done. Occasionally, as I just drive around, I listen to 800 on a radio, the local religious program, and someone was interviewing James Dobson, and this was a number of years ago. And on this particular occasion, something had happened, and he was flying out of California and was sitting in the plane next to a man who was blind. And who knows where they were going, but they were leaving California and headed east. And as the flight went on, he talked to the man who was next to him, and he basically said, "How did you become blind?" And the guy said, "Well, I have a business competitor, and we have a really fierce rivalry, and my competitor hired a hitman to throw acid in my eyes, and I lost my sight when my competitor hired someone to throw acid in my eyes, and so I can't see today." And so after a bit of pause and kind of letting that sink in, then James Dobson said, "Well, what has happened?" And he says, "Well, unknown to him, I have twice made financial investments into his company when he's been struggling financially, because I figure if I lost my sight, why should I lose my soul because of retaliation and anger?" And I've tried to think, what would Jesus do? And he says, he doesn't know this, but twice I have made financial investments to keep his company solvent as my competitor, because my human tendency is to retaliate. But why should I lose twice, having lost my sight, to possibly lose my soul? And that's very much the spirit of the man after God's own heart. I will not touch the Lord's anointed. And by not doing that, the demise of Saul is going to bring about the rise of David. But it was the Lord's timing, it was the Lord's work, and the man after God's own heart would not physically touch or harm a hair on the man who was trying to kill him, because he was the Lord's anointed.